In the summer of 1947, something fell from the sky over New Mexico. We've been arguing about what it was ever since. But in 1974, a leather-bound diary surfaced in the estate of a deceased Army nurse, a woman named Margaret Ellen Reyes, and inside it was a handwritten account of what she described as holding the hand of a dying extraterrestrial being. Not a weather balloon, not a crash test dummy. An alien, a grey-skinned, large-eyed creature from somewhere else entirely. The diary sat in a cardboard box for 27 years before anyone read it carefully enough to ask the right questions. I read it, and I couldn't stop. Let me tell you exactly what Margaret Reyes wrote. It is July 8th, 1947. The entry begins at what she estimates is 2 in the morning. Though she notes her watch had stopped, she doesn't know when, she doesn't know why, only that it had, and that time from that point forward felt wrong. Her words, not mine. Time felt wrong. She had been called to a restricted hangar at Roswell Army Airfield under circumstances she describes as irregular. No written order, no formal briefing. A man in a uniform she didn't fully recognize, not Air Force, not Army standard, something in between, came to her barracks door and told her she was needed. She asked what for. He said only, "There are injured." She went, and here is where Margaret Reyes' account stops resembling anything in the official record and starts resembling something else entirely. The hangar, she writes, had been divided by a series of canvas partitions. There were bright lights, surgical lights, she specifies, the kind used in operating theatres, positioned over 3 separate stations. She describes a smell she cannot place, not antiseptic, not blood. Something mineral, she says, like copper and rain. She moves through the partitions. At the first 2 stations, she sees what she initially takes to be badly burned human beings. Small, pale. Their proportions, she writes, are not quite right in ways I could not immediately name. Their heads appear large relative to their torsos. Their limbs seem elongated. She attributes this briefly to the lighting, to shock, to the fact that it is 2 in the morning and she has been pulled from sleep without explanation. She keeps moving, and that is where her account becomes impossible to dismiss. At the 3rd station, separated from the others by a thicker partition, canvas reinforced with what she thinks is metal framing, she finds a being that is, in her words, unquestionably not human. She writes this without drama, without exclamation. In the same measured handwriting she uses to note the weather or describe her evening meals. Unquestionably not human. 4 words, the calmest 4 words in the diary. It is approximately 4 feet tall. Its skin is described as grey, not pale, not white, but grey, the grey of old ash or overcast sky. Its head is large, disproportionate and smooth. Its eyes are open. She describes them as black, entirely black, containing no visible iris or sclera. And yet, and she emphasizes this, she has the sensation of being looked at, of being seen in some complete and total way she does not have language for. It is breathing. Barely. She reaches for its hand because she writes, that is what she would do for any patient who was dying and alone and afraid. She is a nurse. That is what nurses do. And this is the sentence I keep returning to, the one I've read 40, 50, 60 times now. Its fingers closed around mine with something I can only describe as recognition, as though it had been waiting for exactly this, not for help, not for medicine, but for someone to stay. She stays for what she estimates as 40 minutes, though she acknowledges again that time in that space does not feel reliable. At some point the being's grip loosens. The eyes remain open. She writes, I believe it passed. I do not know where it passed to. Then the man in the unrecognizable uniform is at her shoulder and she is escorted out. Now, here is where the skeptic in me raises a handwritten diary, a deceased nurse, a story that emerged 27 years after the events it describes, surfacing in an estate sale in Albuquerque in the spring of 1974, purchased by a retired schoolteacher named Dorothea Class for 60 cents as part of a box of miscellaneous papers. Class, who passed away in 1991, gave the diary to her nephew Harold Class, who kept it in his garage in Flagstaff, Arizona, apparently unaware of what it contained, until a researcher named Philip Oates came across a reference to it in a letter published in a small New Mexico Historical Society newsletter in 1999. I want you to hold the chain of custody in your mind. Reyes writes it in 1947. It sits, presumably, in her private possession until her death, which records suggest occurred in late 1973. Her estate is processed quickly, suspiciously quickly, some have noted, within 4 months of her death, and the diary enters the estate sale as an unlabelled item in an unlabelled box. Class buys it without knowing what it is. It sits in a garage in Flagstaff for 25 years. Oates, a researcher with no institutional affiliation and no particular agenda, finds a 3-line reference to it in an obscure newsletter and tracks down Harold Class. Oates photographs all 43 pages of the diary in 2001 and shares them with a small group of researchers. He dies of a heart attack in 2003 at the age of 51. I am not saying that means anything. I am saying that every single person who had direct physical access to the original diary is now dead. The diary itself has not been seen since 2003. Harold Class, when contacted by 2 separate researchers in 2008 and 2011, said only that the diary was no longer in his possession and declined to elaborate. He died in 2016. The photographs Oates took, 43 pages, 35mm film, developed at a shop in Tucson, were shared with 4 individuals. 2 of those individuals have not been locatable since approximately 2005. One provided copies to a colleague before losing her own set in a house fire in Portland in 2009. The 4th set of photographs, and the only complete set that researchers believe still exists, is a 2nd-generation photocopy held by a retired archivist in Santa Fe who has, as of this writing, declined all requests for public access. Once you understand the shape of that chain, you cannot unknow it. The official explanation for the disappearance of the physical diary is that there is no official explanation, because no official body has ever acknowledged the diary's existence. Not the Air Force, not the National Archives, not the Roswell Army Airfield Historical Record Office. As far as any institution is concerned, Margaret Ellen Reyes' diary does not exist, has never existed, and the name Margaret Ellen Reyes appears nowhere in any declassified personnel file from the period. And here is where the absence itself becomes the evidence. Roswell Army Airfield in 1947 employed, by various declassified estimates, somewhere between 200 and 400 support personnel, including medical staff. Those personnel records have been, over the decades, gradually declassified. Researchers have identified nurses, orderlies, physicians, and medical aides by name across multiple document releases, dating from 1979 to 2011. Margaret Ellen Reyes does not appear in any of them, not as a nurse, not as a civilian contractor, not in any capacity. This raises a question that the deeper you go, the louder it gets. Was she never there? Or was she there in a way that someone needed erased? I want to go back into the hangar because I think we've moved past it too quickly. Margaret Reyes was a trained medical professional. Whatever her personal beliefs, whatever the era, whatever the circumstances, she was someone trained to observe, to categorize, to record. And she records in that diary specific physiological details that I find impossible to attribute to imagination or hysteria. She notes that the being has no visible ears, no external ear structures at all, only slight depressions on either side of the skull at roughly the position where ears would be. She notes that it has 4 fingers on each hand, not 5, and that the fingers are longer than human fingers and taper to rounded rather than squared tips. She notes that its nose is minimal, 2 small slits rather than a protruding structure, and that its mouth is a thin horizontal line that she never sees open. She notes something else, something I've read a dozen times, trying to find another way to interpret it. She writes that as she held its hand, she became aware of something she calls a pressure. Not physical pressure, not pain, but a sense of pressing information, of something being communicated or transmitted or deposited in her mind in a way that bypassed language entirely. She describes a sudden knowledge of coldness, vast, deep dimensional coldness, unlike any cold she has ever experienced. She does not know what it means. She writes, "I felt briefly that I understood where it had come from. Not a place, a distance, a distance. Now, I am a skeptic. I have been a skeptic my entire professional life. I do not take this kind of testimony and run with it unchecked. But I also cannot dismiss it as pure fabrication, because the specific texture of her description, the way she struggles to articulate the untranslatable, the way she acknowledges the limits of her own language, has a quality of authenticity that studied invention rarely achieves. Fabricated accounts tend to be cleaner, more complete. They don't usually include the author admitting they don't know what they're experiencing. And here's the most extraordinary part of the encounter. She asks it a question. She doesn't know if it can hear her, doesn't know if language means anything to it, but she is holding its hand and it is dying, and she asks, "Where do you come from?" She writes that she felt, not heard, not saw, but felt the answer arrive in her chest like a held breath releasing. And the word, the impression, the thing that surfaced is one she writes down in the diary and then crosses out. The crossed out word is still legible in Oates' photographs, Pleiades. She crosses it out. She writes beside it. Not a word, a feeling like that word. I don't know if I chose it or if it was given. I don't know either. But I know that word existed in that diary written in 1947 by a woman who had no evident reason to fabricate it, crossing it out as though even she didn't trust herself to claim it. Margaret Reyes is not singular. That is the thing that reframes everything when you step back far enough. I've spent a long time now gathering accounts that fit a very specific profile. Medical professionals, almost exclusively nurses, with brief documented or rumoured proximity to the Roswell incident in the summer of 1947, who subsequently and quietly disappeared from official records. Not dramatically, not publicly, simply stopped appearing. There is the case of a woman identified in a 1952 letter, a letter held in a private collection in Silver City, New Mexico, only as E.M., described by the letter's author as a colleague from the base who cannot speak about what she attended to in July. E.M. is never mentioned again in any correspondence from that collection. There is a reference in a decommissioned internal report from 1949, a report tangentially related to medical staff reassignments in the Southwest, to personnel with specialized trauma exposure requiring reassignment to non-clinical roles. The report does not specify what kind of trauma. It does not name names. It affects, according to its own language, 14 individuals. 14 medical professionals reassigned out of clinical practice in the Southwest in 1949, 2 years after Roswell, without any documentation of what they were exposed to. The pattern is not loud. It doesn't announce itself, but once you see it, it cannot be unseen. And the deeper the investigation goes, the more this pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. Person witnesses, person documents, person disappears from record, documentation disperses and degrades, and what remains is the faint outline of something enormous that we are somehow never quite allowed to see directly. Why nurses, specifically? I have asked this question to everyone I can find who studies this material seriously. The most compelling answer I've encountered is also the simplest. Nurses are the people in the room when someone is dying, Not doctors who diagnose and treat and move on. Nurses, the ones who stay. If you wanted witnesses to a death that wasn't human, the witnesses you'd have, by professional necessity, would be nurses. And a nurse who held a hand for 40 minutes would know things a doctor who spent 4 minutes with a scalpel would not. She would know the temperature of the skin, whether there was a pulse and what it felt like, whether the breathing had a rhythm, and when it stopped, she would know if something reached back. The diary does not end with the death of the being. Margaret Reyes makes 6 more entries. They span a period of roughly 8 days following the encounter. They are, notably, shorter, as though she is condensing, as though she is aware on some level that she should not be writing this down and is writing it anyway, quickly, before the impulse passes. In the first post-encounter entry, she notes that she has been reassigned, not to another base, not to another unit, to administrative duty at the same facility, processing supply requisitions. She was a trained surgical nurse. She is now counting boxes. In the third entry, she writes that 2 men came to speak with her. She never describes them in detail beyond official in bearing, and that they asked her a series of questions about what she had witnessed. She notes that the questions were framed not as inquiries but as confirmations. They weren't asking what I saw. They were telling me what I had seen and watching to see if I would agree. She did not write what she said to them. She writes only, "I gave them the answer they seemed to require." In the 5th entry, 6 days after the encounter, she writes something that has lodged itself in my thinking permanently. "I am aware that this will sound as though I have lost my mind. I have not. I am more aware of my mind now than I have ever been. This is the problem. I cannot unknow what I know. I can only decide what to do with the knowing." The 6th and final entry is 3 sentences. "I am to be transferred. No destination given. I leave Wednesday." Then nothing. The diary ends. Margaret Reyes, as far as any available record shows, disappears from the documented world in the summer of 1947, re-emerges briefly in a 1963 census record in Albuquerque, and dies in late 1973 with no military service record, no pension documentation, no official acknowledgement of any employment at Roswell Army Airfield. 26 years of a life, undocumented. 26 years between Wednesday and a cardboard box in an estate sale. What was she doing in those years? Where did they send her? Did she ever speak of what she had seen? Did she ever find language for the pressure in her chest, for the cold that wasn't cold, for the grey hand that closed around hers in recognition and then let go? We don't know. We have 43 pages and a name, and the name leads nowhere that anyone has left a door open, and the pages exist in a single set of photographs that no one will share. I keep returning to one thing. Not the being's physiology, not the missing records, not the 14 reassigned nurses or the crossed out word, or the photographs locked in a room in Santa Fe. Not even the chain of coincidences, too many, too clean, too uniformly useful to the idea that none of this happened. I keep returning to the gesture. She reached for its hand, and it held on. What does